So I'd love it if you could do a little reading of something. What would you like to read?
Well, I was thinking I would read something that I haven't read very much from this novel, which is the second chapter, which is the beginning of Alia's perspective.
Oh, I love it. Perfect. And maybe you can also tell us a little bit about how you differentiated the perspectives for this book. Had you always had them in different tenses, and when did that feel like it really worked for you?
So Ava's voice came to me in first person very, very immediately. And I don't really like working in first person, but it didn't feel like I could write her any other way because her narrative voice is so strong. She's so bold and she so knows what she wants that she always had to be in first person for me. And then Alia's took me a little bit more time and she's in the third person past tense. And that's because even though I feel like you can get a lot of there's beautiful novels in close third and you can feel very close to a character that way. I feel like because of the difference between the timelines and because hers was in the past, it needed that almost like storybook feeling, and third person felt like it really worked for that. So it's chapter 2, but kind of chapter 1 for Alia. They were born 6 months apart, 2 cities on either side of the planet. Alia was the elder, though it made more sense for it to be the other way around, for her to have followed Ava into the world as she did with everything else. Sometimes she thought it would make more sense if they'd been born on the same day, from the same womb, her hand on Ava's foot as the doctor tugged her out. 6 months apart, Alia in the summer, Ava in the cold. 18 years later, Alia was born again when they met. That was the true beginning. When Alia got to university, she mostly stopped speaking. It happened quite gradually. First, on the plane on the way over, she noticed the comfort of silence, of not needing to communicate with anyone except to hand over her ticket or passport and listen to their instructions. She didn't need many words. Nods and gestures of agreement sufficed. When she arrived at the other end, her throat was soft from the rest. She was to spend a week in London before Mount Brook, staying with her Chala and Khalu. Chala picked her up from the airport. They hadn't seen each other for a few years. Chala looked at her jeans, her mother's jumper, and sighed. When I came to London for the first time, she said, I wore a sari and went to the salon before my flight. I had a bun and a beehive. People were different in those days. Leaving home was a serious business. Khala's house was small and neat, a quiet place on a quiet tree-lined street. Mostly it was just the two of them. Her husband worked long hours in the civil service. As a child, Alia had thought he was a spy. On visits to Pakistan, he was always disappearing from dinners to answer calls on his mobile phone, long before most people had mobile phones. Khala seemed glad of her company, and told her all the stories she could remember about the old country and her life in it. Sometimes she would ask a question, but when Alia opened her mouth to respond, she'd have drifted on to something else. Years of being married to a man who was never home had turned her into a one-sided conversationalist. At the end of the week, she drove Alia to university. They packed the car with everything she thought a student might need. Warm clothes, sheets and pillows, a single plate and cup, cutlery from her own drawers. These slotted safely beside the things Alia's mother had sent. A prayer mat, a framed picture of their family at Eid, a selection of her favourite snacks wrapped lovingly twice in bubble wrap so they would survive the journey. Mount Brook sat on the outside belt of the London suburbs, in a small town. It was a 19th century invention, built to look older. You half expected a moat as you came up to it. It began life as a women's institution, and Alia imagined Victorian suffragettes writing screeds in it. It stood out of the town, a big red brick building climbing out of the forest and towards the sky like a castle. It had been chosen by Alia and by most others for its singular beautiful building that was on the front of all the brochures. There were no buildings that looked like that in her school in Karachi. The city was concrete clusters dotted with colonial ruins. The rest of the university was temporary 70s porter cabins that had never been replaced, but she hadn't seen them yet. The fairy tale brochure was all she could see. Her home and her prison for the next 3 years. It was like landing on Mars. The unfamiliarity crisp with every breath. Somehow she'd expected to walk into a novel, a world laid out for her, the way it seemed to be for her young heroines and boarding schools, expecting to slip right into a cast of characters who would be her friends, people who would teach her how to live here in this cold place. What she'd hoped for, the Enid Blyton dream, seemed very far away. She became an anchoress in her own body, lips sealed in an unspoken pact. This was how she began her new life.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for reading that. It's nice to be introduced to Mount Brook again. I love this kind of fictional world that you build because I can just imagine it so clearly. Why did you choose to not set that an existing institution and create somewhere new?
I think for the freedom of it, so that you can sort of make stuff up and not have people message you saying, I went to this university in this year and it wasn't like that at all. I sometimes think fudging things like that a little bit is a nice way to give yourself a bit of freedom. Also, there's something a bit fun about like naming your own university and giving it sort of so that it can represent different things. So you can sort of like pull things from different places. There's a writer called Daniel Handler who wrote the Lemony Snicket books, but then he's also written books in his name, Daniel Handler, for kids and for teenagers, but also for adults. And he does this thing in his work where every film that's in it and every book that's in it is created by him. I've always thought that seems really fun because he sort of gives them... You can tell when you're reading it what that film is meant to symbolise in our world, but because it's completely his invention, it can be sort of like it can be before sunrise and it can also be it happened one night. It can pull those two things together in a way that feels very fun and creative.
That is fun. And also you kind of have more of a control over the narrative without what people would project onto it from their own experience of the world. Daniel Handler also has a great book about writing, which is really good. I'd really recommend. I remember being devastated when those Lemony Snicket books ended. I'd had such a deep connection to them that I couldn't really handle not having any more. I think it was the first time I got really obsessed with a book series. And I think part of it was the invention and the mystery in them.
Yeah, I actually never read them, which is such a weird thing because I really love his other books. I think I watched the film when it came out, but they sort of like passed me by weirdly. I'd love to go back and read them now because I think he's such an interesting writer and like that sense of playfulness. And my impression of them, I don't know because I haven't read them, is that they don't really speak down to kids. They sort of meet you at your level, and you can, if you don't understand something, that's fine. You just keep reading.
And there's a lot of darkness in them, which I used to really enjoy. And a lot of great hair accessories, which was also probably why I was obsessed with that. One of the things that I love about Strange Girls, and you kind of begin to touch on in this fairy tale storybook way, is how obsessed these two characters are with different art and film noir and the idea of being a strange girl. And I think most readers reading that, you then really reflect on your own life going to university for the first time and how much your personality is formed on the music you like, the books that you read. How did you choose what kind of like literary world you were going to have them in? Because that all feels so real. Was that like, did you want to pick the books and films that you loved at that age? Or did you want to make that separate to you? So you kind of had to imagine what the posters were in their room and everything like that?
It's kind of a combination of the two. Like I gave them some of the books that were really formative to me because I felt like they were important to sort of situate, because the novels that they read and that they give each other have to do two things in the book. They have to tell us who they are and who they think they are. And then they're also a code between the two of them because they have all of these like wild, deep feelings for each other that they can't quite name or admit to. So every time they're sending each other a song or a book or a poem, it has to hold that feeling as well as the world in it. So some stuff like The Secret History is a novel that I read when I first went to university, but it's also so perfectly the Strange Girl novel that I couldn't have not included it, because I think it just perfectly encapsulates that sense of the pretentiousness of it, but also this sense of being taken in by other people and wanting to be like them. Secret History is obviously this fantastic sort of like cult crime novel, and it's a brilliant story in so many different ways. It's a brilliant story about being a young person who's studying the classics and like doing bacchanals and all the thing. It's also a great novel about an only child who comes to university and looks at this group of people and is like, that's what I'm going to be. So it felt like that had to be in it. The other piece of literature that's most important in it that I actually didn't read until I think my late 20s is The Age of Innocence. That I felt like was doing both of the things, in that I felt like they would obviously be reading Edith Wharton because they feel like the kind of girls who would. But also there's a sort of unspoken love story in it between Newland Archer and Countess Olenska. And there's this relationship that they have that completely changes Newland. And he starts the novel as this very confident man who thinks he knows everything there is to know about the world, and he knows how he's going to live his life. And he's in fact preparing to teach his young bride how all about life and all about how to be a person and to educate her and broaden her mind. And he feels very fixed. And then Countess Olenska sort of like crashes into his life like a train, and everything he's known changes. And even though other people don't necessarily perceive their relationship that way, and even though it's this sort of like thing that happens behind closed doors and in the margins of both of their lives, it changes them completely. And I wanted Strange Girls to be a book about a relationship that can't define you to other people because you haven't gotten married or you haven't declared yourselves to each other in that way. But even though it's happening in the margins of your life, it's changed you completely.
That's so interesting hearing you talk about that, because it really helps me kind of understand how the mechanisms behind Strange Girls work. Because I suppose a lot of what you would have been wrestling with as a writer is like, to what extent do I have these two people end up together? But actually knowing that The Age of Innocence is a big inspiration, and so much of that is like, well, they can't be together, but that doesn't mean their whole world hasn't changed, really makes a lot of sense. It's interesting to hear the kind of ways in which you're in dialogue with a work like that.
That's kind of been one of the interesting things, is that one of the questions I most get asked is why their relationship is so ambiguous and why it's never sort of decided that, oh, they're just platonic friends or they're actually secretly in love with each other. And to me, that ambiguity is the whole point. Like it's the whole plot, is that they're not able to admit these feelings and they don't know what they want from each other. And that misunderstanding and that lack of clarity is what makes every movement in the book happen. Because if they had said anything, or if it had been different, it would have been a completely different novel.
And also not true to life. One of the words you've used a few times to describe like writing or plot is like alive. And I think that's really good. I'm going to like take that from this, that's how problems, questions, plot points should feel, that there's something within them that feels like an alive thread that has a rawness and a reality to it. And that's really important.
It's the hardest thing, isn't it? I think it's the hardest thing as a writer, because so many stories have been written and people are so, as people who read a lot and who watch a lot of films and who go to the theatre and you watch a lot of comedy, like we're so engaged in narrative and in stories, and there are only a few ways that people can go and there is only a few decisions that people can make. But anytime you write it, you want it to feel alive and you want to feel like the reader doesn't know what they're going to do next.